My stepmother kicked me out at 18. This isn't your house. Dad stayed silent. 20 years later, she called, "Your father's dead. Come to the funeral." I showed up with a document that changed everything. The air in my room on my 18th birthday smelled like old books and the faint, sweet scent of the honeysuckle vine that climbed the trellis outside my window. It was late afternoon in August, the kind of heavy, humid day in Ohio where the air feels thick enough to swim through. I was lying on my bed, staring at the ceiling, tracing the faint water stain that looked a little like a map of a country I'd never visit. Downstairs, I could hear the clinking of dishes. Brenda was cleaning. She was always cleaning. It was her way of imposing order on a world she couldn't otherwise control, and that included me. I was the biggest mess in her otherwise pristine life. The door creaked open, and my dad, Robert, stood there, hesitating in the doorway as he always did, as if he needed a special invitation to enter a room in his own house. "Hey, Jake," he said, his voice soft. "Brenda's almost done with dinner. Your favorite." I knew what that meant. Overcooked pot roast with mushy carrots. It hadn't been my favorite since I was 10, but it was the one meal my mother used to make that Brenda had bothered to learn. It felt less like a treat and more like a ghost at the dinner table. "Okay, Dad. Be down in a minute." He nodded but didn't leave. He just stood there, his shoulders slumped, his eyes looking past me at the wall. 18, he said, more to himself than to me. "Big day, son. A real milestone. You're a man now." The words felt hollow. A man. What did that even mean? Did it mean I was supposed to understand the silence that had filled this house since my mom died 6 years ago? A silence my father seemed content to live in, and one Brenda seemed to cultivate, like one of her prize-winning but scentless roses in the front garden. I sat up. "Yeah, I guess so." He finally looked at me, a flicker of something in his eyes. Sadness, maybe, or guilt. "Your mother. She would have been so proud of you, Jake." That was the one thing that could still break through my defenses. The mention of my mom. He knew it, and he used it. Maybe not maliciously, but he used it. It was his way of trying to connect, to bridge the chasm that had opened between us the day he brought Brenda home, just a year after the funeral. I just nodded, not trusting my voice. He gave a weak smile and retreated, closing the door softly behind him. Dinner was exactly as I'd expected. Tense. The three of us sat at the polished mahogany table my mother had picked out. Brenda had placed a single, unlit candle in the center. A birthday candle, I supposed. It felt more like a memorial. "So, Jacob," Brenda began, her voice crisp and formal. She always called me Jacob. "What are your plans, now that you've graduated and are officially an adult?" She cut her roast into a perfect tiny square. Everything she did was precise, measured. I had plans. I wanted to go to community college, maybe study drafting or architecture. I loved the idea of building things, of creating spaces for people to live in. But I hadn't talked to them about it yet. It felt too personal, too much a part of me to share at this table. "I'm still figuring it out," I mumbled, pushing a carrot around my plate. "Well," she said, dabbing her lips with a cloth napkin, "you can't just figure it out while living here. This isn't a hotel. Robert and I have given you a wonderful home, a stable environment. But adulthood comes with responsibilities." I looked at my dad. He was staring intently at his plate, as if the secret to the universe was hidden in his mashed potatoes. He wasn't going to say anything. He never did. "I know that," I said, my voice a little sharper than I intended. "I've been looking for a job. A job is a start, Brenda conceded. But you need a plan, a real one. The conversation fizzled out after that. We ate in silence, the only sound the scrape of silverware on porcelain. After dinner, Brenda presented me with a small, neatly wrapped gift. It was a leather-bound journal and an expensive-looking pen. "For your plans?" she said with a tight smile. It felt like a command, not a gift. My dad gave me a card with a $100 bill inside. For a new start, he'd written. It felt like severance pay. The breaking point came later that night. My friend Mike had called and invited me to hang out with a few guys to celebrate my birthday. It was nothing wild, just sitting in his basement, listening to music. I got back around 11:30, well before the midnight curfew Brenda had unofficially imposed. As I came in, I tried to be quiet, but the front door always stuck. The groan of old wood echoed through the silent house. I was halfway up the stairs when the light flicked on. Brenda was standing at the bottom, her arms crossed, her silk robe pulled tight. "And where have you been?" she asked, her voice low and cold. "I was out with Mike. It's my birthday," I said, trying to keep my own voice level. "It is your birthday," she agreed. "Which is why I find it so disrespectful that you would sneak out and then come clomping in here at all hours. Some of us have to work in the morning." I wasn't sneaking out, and I wasn't clomping. It's not even midnight. My frustration was starting to boil over. This wasn't about the noise. It was never about the thing she said it was about. It was about control. "Don't you take that tone with me, young man," she hissed. "I will not be disrespected in my own home." And that's when I said it. The words just came out, a torrent of years of resentment. "It's not just your home. It was my mom's home. I was born in this house." Her face went pale, then flushed with a dark, ugly red. For a second, I thought she was going to scream. Instead, her voice dropped to a terrifying whisper. "Your mother is gone, and this house belongs to your father and me now. It stopped being your house a long time ago. You just haven't been paying attention." The landing light flicked on. My dad was standing there, blinking in the sudden brightness, his pajamas rumpled. "What's going on?" Brenda didn't even look at him. Her eyes were locked on me, filled with a kind of triumphant fury. "It's time, Robert. We've discussed this. He's 18 now. He's a man. He needs to be on his own." I looked at my dad, my heart pounding in my chest, a desperate plea in my eyes. "Say something. Defend me. Tell her she's wrong. Tell me this is still my home." He looked from my face to hers, his own expression a mask of conflict and weakness. He opened his mouth and then closed it. He ran a hand through his thinning hair and looked down at his bare feet. He wouldn't meet my eyes. He just stood there, in the middle of the staircase, a silent judge delivering a verdict without a word. His silence was louder than any shout. It was a confirmation. It was an agreement. It was the deepest betrayal I had ever known. Brenda saw her victory in his silence. A cruel, thin smile touched her lips. She turned her gaze back to me. "You heard him," she said, though he'd said nothing at all. "You have until the end of the weekend to pack your things and leave. This isn't your house anymore." She turned and walked back toward their bedroom, her posture ramrod straight. My dad still stood there for a moment, a statue of indecision. He finally looked up at me, his eyes full of a pathetic, watery apology that did nothing to soothe the gaping wound he had just allowed to be torn open in my chest. Then he turned and followed his wife. I was left alone on the stairs, the ugly overhead light buzzing. The smell of honeysuckle from my open window seemed sickeningly sweet. I walked back to my room in a daze. My room. For 3 more days. I looked around at the posters on the wall, the worn spot on the carpet by my desk, the bookshelf filled with stories I'd escaped into since I was a boy. None of it was mine. It was just stuff in a room in a house that belonged to someone else. I sank onto my bed, the expensive journal Brenda had given me lying on my nightstand. For my plans. I finally had one. I had to get out. I had to survive. And I had to do it all on my own. The silence from my father's room was the last thing I heard before the sun came up on the first day of the rest of my life. The next 3 days passed in a blur of surreal, quiet horror. It was like living in a house with ghosts, where I was the one who was haunting the place. Brenda was coldly efficient, never speaking to me directly, but making her presence known. She left a stack of cardboard boxes outside my door on Friday morning. No note. Just the boxes. A silent command. I spent the day pulling my life off shelves and out of drawers. Every object held a memory, a sting. The faded baseball trophy from when I was 12, the year my mom was still alive to cheer from the stands. My dad had been there too, his arm around her, both of them smiling. I wrapped it carefully in an old t-shirt and placed it in a box. The concert ticket stubs from shows I'd gone to with Mike. The worn copy of To Kill a Mockingbird my mom had given me. Her inscription on the inside cover in her looping, elegant handwriting. For my Jake. May you always stand up for what's right. I held the book to my chest, the irony so sharp it felt like a physical pain. My dad was a phantom. He left for work early and came home late. We didn't speak. On Saturday, he cornered me in the hallway as I was carrying a box downstairs. "Jake," he started, his voice thick. "Listen." I stopped and looked at him, waiting. I don't know what I was hoping for. An apology, an explanation, a last-minute reprieve. He just wrung his hands. Life. It's complicated. Brenda, she just thinks it's for the best. For you to, stand on your own 2 feet. And what do you think, Dad? I asked, my voice flat, empty of emotion. I was too hurt to be angry anymore. He looked away at the family photo on the wall, the one of him and Brenda, taken on their honeymoon. There were no pictures of my mother in the house anymore. I just want you to be okay, he finished lamely. I will be, I said, and it was a promise to myself, not a reassurance for him. No thanks to you? I walked past him and out the front door, the screen door slamming shut behind me. I didn't look back to see his reaction. I had called Mike the night it happened, my voice breaking over the phone. He didn't hesitate. "Dude, my couch is your couch, for as long as you need." His parents, a kind, boisterous couple who always had a full fridge and an open door, welcomed me with hugs and sympathetic eyes, which was almost worse than the coldness at home. I felt like a charity case. I stored my few boxes in their garage and tried to make myself as small as possible on their plaid sofa. The first year was the hardest. The shame was a constant companion. I got a job washing dishes at a local diner, the smell of grease and stale coffee clinging to me long after my shift ended. I'd come back to Mike's house late at night, exhausted and sore, and study for my GED. I had dropped out of my own life so suddenly, I hadn't even had the chance to pick up my official high school diploma. Brenda had probably thrown it in the trash. After a few months, I had saved up enough to rent a tiny room in a house on the other side of town. It was bleak and smelled of damp. But it was mine. The freedom was exhilarating and terrifying in equal measure. I learned how to budget, how to cook cheap meals, how to fix a running toilet by watching videos online. I was building a life from scratch, with no instructions and no safety net. My father and Brenda never called, not for Christmas, not for my 19th birthday. The silence was absolute. It was clear they had written me out of their story. I got my GED and enrolled in night classes at the local community college, just as I'd planned. I took a second job working weekends with a construction crew to pay for it. The work was brutal, especially during the cold Ohio winters, but I loved it. I loved the feeling of physical exhaustion at the end of the day, the satisfaction of seeing something tangible rise from a blueprint. It was the opposite of the life I'd left, where everything was about appearances and unspoken resentments. Here, things were simple. You worked hard, you built something strong, and it stood. It was in a drafting class that I met Sarah. She was smart, funny, and had a warmth that seemed to radiate from her. She had kind eyes that actually saw me, not the lost kid I felt like, but the person I was trying to become. We started as study partners, our sessions fueled by cheap coffee and a shared ambition. She wanted to be an architect. We'd spend hours hunched over drafting tables, talking about designs and dreams. She never pried about my family, but I eventually told her everything, the words tumbling out one night in the front seat of my beat-up car. She just listened, her hand on my arm, and when I was done, she didn't offer pity. She just said, "They're lost, Jake. They're huge, stupid loss." She became my family. Her parents welcomed me into their chaotic, loving home for Sunday dinners. They remembered my birthday. They celebrated my small victories, passing a tough exam, getting a raise at the construction site. With Sarah by my side, the world started to feel less like a battlefield and more like a place where I could actually build a future. We got married 2 days after my 23rd birthday at the local courthouse with Mike and her sister as witnesses. We didn't have money for anything fancy, but it was the happiest day of my life. We rented a small apartment with a leaky faucet and mismatched furniture, but it was our home, our sanctuary. Years passed. I finished my associate's degree and used my construction experience to get a job as a project manager for a small building firm. I was good at it. I understood the work from the ground up, and I knew how to talk to the guys on the crew because I had been one of them. Sarah finished her degree and got a job at a prestigious architectural firm downtown. We saved, we worked, we built our life together, brick by brick. We bought a small starter house in a quiet suburban neighborhood. We had our son Liam, and then, 2 years later, our daughter Chloe. My life was full. I had a loving wife, 2 beautiful kids, a job I was proud of, and a home that was truly ours. The ache from my past had faded into a dull scar, a story I rarely told. The silence from my father and Brenda had stretched into a full 2 decades, 20 years, an entire lifetime. I had built a world for myself that they had no part in. I had proven to myself, if to no one else, that I could stand on my own 2 feet. And then, one Tuesday afternoon, as I was sitting at my desk reviewing a set of blueprints, my phone rang. It was an unknown number. I almost didn't answer, but something made me press the green button. "Hello?" I said. There was a pause, and then a voice, older and more brittle than I remembered, but still unmistakably her. "Jacob, is that you?" It was Brenda. Hearing Brenda's voice after 20 years was like being struck by lightning on a clear day. Time collapsed. I was 18 again, standing on the stairs, the word leave echoing in the silent house. My hand tightened on the phone, my knuckles white. My office, with its organized clutter of blueprints and coffee mugs, suddenly felt alien. The air grew thick, What do you want, Brenda? My voice was rougher than I intended, scraped raw by the sudden onslaught of memory. There was a carefully constructed sigh on the other end of the line, the kind of sound designed to elicit sympathy. Jacob, I'm not calling to argue. I'm calling with difficult news. She paused, letting the silence hang in the air for dramatic effect. It's your father. He passed away this morning, a heart attack. It was very sudden. The world tilted on its axis. My father, dead. A complicated storm of emotions swirled inside me, a pang of grief so sharp it took my breath away, immediately followed by a wave of cold, hard anger. Grief for the father I'd loved as a boy, the one who taught me how to ride a bike and bait a hook. Anger at the man who stood by and watched my world crumble, who chose silence over his own son. How could I grieve a man I hadn't spoken to in 2 decades? And how could I not? The funeral is on Saturday, Brenda continued, her voice maintaining a tone of practiced solemnity. At St. James Chapel at 11. I thought, despite everything, you should know. He was still your father. The audacity of it. The hypocrisy. She was the one who had severed that tie, who had orchestrated my exile. And now she was playing the part of the dutiful messenger, invoking a relationship she had systematically destroyed. I wanted to hang up. I wanted to scream at her. But I couldn't. A strange, morbid curiosity held me in place. Okay, I managed to say, the single word feeling like a monumental effort. I hope you'll consider coming, she added, a faint, almost challenging note in her voice. It would be the right thing to do. And then she hung up. I sat there, staring at the phone, the silence of my office now roaring in my ears. The right thing to do? Her words looped in my head. What was the right thing? For 20 years, the right thing had been to stay away, to build my own life, to protect myself and my family from the toxicity I'd escaped. Did his death change that? That evening, I told Sarah, we were in the kitchen, the kids supposedly doing their homework at the table, though Liam was mostly trying to balance a spoon on his nose. The familiar, chaotic warmth of my own home was a stark contrast to the cold memory the phone call had resurrected. I waited until the kids were in bed. Then I laid it all out for her. She listened, her expression full of empathy. When I finished, she took my hand. Oh, Jake, I'm so sorry. I don't even know what I'm feeling, I confessed, my voice low. It's like he died for me 20 years ago. But hearing it, it's different. It's final. Of course it is, she said softly. You're allowed to feel whatever you feel. Sad, angry, confused, all of it. She squeezed my hand. So, the funeral? Are you going to go? That was the question, wasn't it? I don't know, I said honestly. Why should I? For her? To watch her play the grieving widow? But he was still my dad. I feel like if I don't go, I'll regret it. Like there's a door that will never be closed. Then you should go, Sarah said, her voice firm but gentle. Not for her, for you. Go and say your goodbye to the father you remember, the one you lost a long time ago. And I'll be right here when you get back. Her support was the anchor I needed. I decided I would go. It would be a day trip, drive down, attend the service, and get out. No drama, no confrontation, just a quiet, final farewell. The next few days were strange. I felt detached, moving through my life like a spectator. On Thursday night, 2 days before the funeral, I was in the attic, looking for a dark suit to wear. Our attic was a repository of forgotten things, old baby clothes, holiday decorations, and a few of my own boxes that had survived all the moves since I'd first left home. Tucked in a corner was a dusty cardboard box labeled Grandma Helen's Things. My mom's mom. She had passed away about 5 years after my own mother, and my dad had unceremoniously dropped the box off at my crummy apartment at the time. One of the only times I'd seen him in that first year. "Your grandmother wanted you to have this," he'd mumbled, and left before I could say much. I had never really gone through it. Driven by a sudden impulse, I sliced open the old tape. Inside were photo albums, a few pieces of her china wrapped in newspaper, and a thick manila envelope with my name, Jacob, written on the front in her shaky, elderly script. I didn't remember ever seeing it before. I pulled it out. It was heavy. Inside there was a smaller, sealed envelope, and a thick sheaf of folded legal documents held together with a rusty paperclip. The smaller envelope was also addressed to me. Below my name, she had written, "To be opened when you are a man, and you need to remember your mother's strength." My breath caught in my throat. When you are a man. My dad's hollow words on my 18th birthday. But this felt different. This felt real. My hands trembled slightly as I carefully broke the seal. Inside was a letter, several pages long, written in my mother's familiar looping hand. It was dated just a few weeks before she died. "My dearest Jake," it began. "If you are reading this, it means I am gone, and you have grown into the fine young man I always knew you would be. I am writing this because I need you to know how much I love you. My love for you is the biggest and truest thing in my life." Tears pricked my eyes as I read on. She wrote about her hopes for my future, about her love for my father. But she also wrote about her worries. She wrote about a shadow of practicality in him that sometimes worried her, a willingness to take the easy path. And then came the lines that made me stop breathing. "This house, Jake," she wrote, "is more than just wood and nails. It was my parents' home, and it is my home. It is your legacy. I have made arrangements to ensure it will always be a safe harbor for you, no matter what storms may come. I have spoken to a lawyer. I have made my wishes clear. Your father is a good man, but I need to know you will always be protected. The house is yours. I have set it up in a way that he can live here for as long as he lives. But ownership, true and final, belongs to you. It is my gift, my anchor for you in this world. Don't ever let anyone take it from you." My head was spinning. I unfolded the other documents. They were legal papers, full of dense jargon, but the heading was clear: Irrevocable Trust Agreement. I scanned the pages, my heart pounding. It was all there. The property, my childhood home, had been placed into a trust upon my mother's death. The sole beneficiary of that trust was me, Jacob Thomas Miller. My father, Robert Miller, was granted lifetime residency, a life estate, but he was a steward, not the owner. Upon his death, the trust would dissolve, and full, unencumbered ownership of the property would pass directly to me. He had known. My father had known the entire time. When Brenda stood in that hallway and said, "This isn't your house," she was lying. And my father, by staying silent, had endorsed that lie. He had let her kick me out of a house that was legally, fundamentally mine. He had chosen his new wife's comfort over his son's birthright. The betrayal was staggering, so much deeper and more calculated than I had ever imagined. I sank back on my heels on the dusty attic floor, the letter in one hand, the deed in the other. My trip on Saturday was no longer just about attending a funeral. It was about something else entirely. It was about reclaiming a truth that had been buried for 20 years. I carefully folded the documents and placed them in the inside pocket of my suit jacket. I would go to the funeral. I would pay my respects to the memory of my father. And then I would go back to the house, my house, and I would bring a document that would change everything. The 2-hour drive to my old hometown was a journey through a landscape of ghosts. Every exit sign, every familiar bend in the highway, dredged up a memory I thought I had buried long ago. The town itself hadn't changed much. The same quaint main street, the same town square with its peeling gazebo. But I was seeing it through different eyes now. The eyes of a 38-year-old man, a husband, a father. The town felt smaller, the memories larger. I parked my car a block away from St. James Chapel, the same stone church where my mother's funeral had been held. The irony was a bitter pill. I took a deep breath before getting out of the car. The suit felt stiff and unfamiliar. In the inside pocket, the weight of the documents was a constant, solid reminder of my purpose. This wasn't just about grief or closure anymore. It was about justice. Walking up the stone path to the church doors, I felt a knot of anxiety tighten in my stomach. The air was heavy with the funereal scent of lilies, a smell that instantly transported me back 26 years, to being a small boy in a too big suit, holding my father's hand and not understanding why my mother wasn't waking up. Inside, the chapel was dimly lit, sunlight filtering weakly through the stained glass windows. It was about half full with people I vaguely recognized. Old neighbors, friends of my father's from his work, people whose faces had aged in the intervening 2 decades. Their hushed whispers stopped as I walked in, heads turning, eyes lingering on me with a mixture of curiosity and pity. I was the prodigal son, the ghost at the feast. I saw her before she saw me. Brenda was standing near the front, dressed in a tasteful black dress, a veil partially obscuring her face. She was playing the role of the bereaved widow to perfection, accepting condolences with a delicate, sorrowful nod, dabbing at a dry eye with a lace handkerchief. She looked older, her face etched with fine lines, but the same ramrod-straight posture and air of controlled superiority were unmistakable. My gaze drifted to the open casket at the front of the chapel. My heart hammered against my ribs. Taking slow, deliberate steps, I walked down the aisle. Each step felt a mile long. The organist was playing a somber, generic melody that did nothing to fill the cavernous silence in my own head. I reached the casket and looked down. It was him, my father. He looked smaller in death, his face peaceful in a way I hadn't seen it in years. The lines of worry and weakness that I remembered so clearly seemed to have been smoothed away. All I could see was the man who had taught me to fish, the man whose shoulders I had ridden on at the county fair. A wave of pure, uncomplicated grief washed over me, so powerful it almost buckled my knees. This was my dad, and he was gone. Whatever I had wanted to say to him, to scream at him, to ask him, it was too late. The opportunity was gone forever. I stood there for a long moment, lost in a silent, painful conversation with a man who could no longer answer. Jacob. Brenda's voice, low and smooth, cut through my thoughts. I turned. She had lifted her veil, and her eyes, the same cold, assessing eyes I remembered, were fixed on me. "I'm glad you came," she said, her voice just loud enough for those nearby to hear. It's what he would have wanted. I just nodded, unable to form a coherent reply. The hypocrisy of her words was breathtaking. "He spoke of you, you know," she continued, a little louder. "He always hoped you were doing well." A lie, a bald-faced, calculated lie for the benefit of her audience. If he had spoken of me, if he had cared, he would have picked up the phone. A single phone call in 20 years. That's all it would have taken. but it never came. The service began, and I took a seat in a pew near the back, alone. The minister, a man I didn't know, began his eulogy. He spoke of Robert Miller, the dedicated husband, the pillar of the community, the kind and generous friend. He painted a picture of a man I didn't recognize. He talked about his wonderful marriage to his beloved wife, Brenda, and their beautiful life together in their lovely home. There was no mention of his first wife, my mother. There was no mention of the son he'd had with her. It was as if my mother and I had been completely erased from his history, edited out of the official story of his life. I sat there, my hands clenched into fists in my lap, the paper in my jacket pocket feeling like a hot coal against my chest. I listened to the sanitized version of my father's life and felt a cold resolve settle over me. They had stolen my past, erased my mother's memory, and kicked me out of my own home. They had written their own story, but the truth was in my pocket, and soon everyone was going to hear it. The service ended. Brenda, ever the performer, walked slowly down the aisle, accepting hugs and murmured condolences. When she passed my pew, her eyes met mine for a brief, chilling moment. There was no grief in them. There was only calculation and a warning. I knew then that the final act of this drama wouldn't take place in the house of God, but in the house my mother had left me. The wake was held at the house, my house. Driving there, following the slow procession of cars from the church, felt like moving backward in time. I pulled up across the street, watching as people filtered through the front door that I had walked out of for the last time 20 years ago. The house looked exactly the same from the outside. The same beige siding, the same dark green shutters, the same perfectly manicured lawn that Brenda had always obsessed over. But seeing it now, knowing the truth of its ownership, it looked different. It looked like a crime scene. Stepping inside was the hardest part. The air was thick with the cloying scent of catered food and the murmur of polite conversation. Brenda had redecorated, of course. The warm, slightly cluttered feel my mother had cultivated was gone, replaced by a cold, minimalist aesthetic. It was stylish, expensive, and completely devoid of personality. It was a showroom, not a home. I walked through the downstairs rooms in a daze. The living room, the dining room, the kitchen, all of it was familiar and yet utterly alien. I drifted toward the back of the house and found myself standing at the bottom of the stairs, the very spot where my life had been irrevocably altered. I rested my hand on the newel post, its wood cool and smooth beneath my palm. The memory was so vivid, I could almost hear Brenda's whispered words, feel my father's suffocating silence. It's strange being back, isn't it? I turned. An elderly woman with kind, wrinkled eyes was standing beside me. It took me a moment to place her. It was Mrs. Gable, our old next-door neighbor. She had been a close friend of my mother's. "Mrs. Gable?" I said, a genuine warmth in my voice for the first time all day. "It's good to see you." "You too, Jacob. You've grown into a fine-looking man," she said, patting my arm. Her eyes were sad. "I was so sorry to hear about your father, and I was always so sorry about everything." She lowered her voice. "Your mother, Helen, she adored you. She talked about you all the time. She always said this house was your future." My heart gave a lurch. "She did?" "Oh, yes." Mrs. Gable nodded emphatically. "She told me once, not long before she passed. She said, 'I've made sure of it, Eleanor. I've made sure Jake will always have this place. It's his anchor.' She was a smart woman, your mother. Fiercely protective. Don't you ever forget that." Her words were a balm, a confirmation from the past. It wasn't just a legal document. It was my mother's will, her intention, her love made tangible. "Thank you for telling me that, Mrs. Gable," I said, my voice thick with emotion. "It means more than you know." She gave my arm another squeeze and then moved on, leaving me with her powerful words echoing in my mind. I continued my slow tour of the house. People would occasionally approach me, offering awkward condolences. "So sorry for your loss. We haven't seen you in ages." I was a curiosity, a relic from a forgotten era of this house's history. I noticed Brenda watching me from across the room, her eyes narrowed. She was a spider, and I was a fly buzzing too close to her web. I made my way upstairs. I had to see my old room. The door was open. I stepped inside. It was a guest room now, painted a sterile beige with a generic hotel-style painting of a seascape on the wall. The bookshelf was gone. The water stain on the ceiling had been painted over. The window that looked out on the honeysuckle vine was covered by heavy, impersonal drapes. There was no trace of me, no evidence that a boy had ever grown up in this room. They hadn't just removed me from the house. They had erased me. A cold, hard anger, pure and clean, began to solidify in my chest, burning away the grief and confusion. As I was coming back down the stairs, I overheard Brenda's voice from the living room. She was speaking in a hushed, confidential tone to a man in a pinstripe suit, who I instantly recognized as her brother, a notoriously slick real estate agent. "Get it on the market by the end of the month," she was saying. "The market is hot right now, and a house this size in this neighborhood. We should be able to get top dollar. I'm thinking of moving to one of those new condo developments in Florida. Less upkeep." The man, her brother, nodded. "Just need to get the estate settled. The will is straightforward, since Robert's name was the only one on the deed. Should be a quick probate." My blood ran cold. The sheer, unadulterated greed. My father hadn't even been gone for a full day, and she was already planning on selling my home, my mother's legacy, to fund her retirement in the sun. And she was so confident, so sure of her position, because she believed the lie that my father had helped her create. The deed, the will, it was all built on a foundation of sand. I stood at the edge of the living room, watching them. Brenda, seeing me, ended her conversation abruptly and glided over, her public face of sorrow firmly back in place. "Jacob," she said smoothly, "I hope you're doing all right. This must be very difficult for you coming back here after all this time." "It's certainly been illuminating," I said, my voice dangerously calm. A flicker of unease crossed her face. "Well, I'm glad you could be here. Why don't you get something to eat? The caterers brought a lovely spread." She was trying to dismiss me, to handle me, to move me along like any other guest. But I wasn't any other guest. I was the master of the house. I just hadn't announced it yet. "Actually, Brenda," I said, my voice just loud enough to make a few nearby heads turn, "there's something I need to discuss with you, and your brother might want to hear this as well." The stage was set. The audience was assembled. It was time to pull back the curtain. My voice cut through the low hum of conversation. A small circle of silence formed around us. Brenda's polite smile faltered, replaced by a look of wary irritation. Her brother, the real estate agent, turned toward me with a condescending smirk, as if I were a child interrupting adult conversation. "Now's not really the time, Jacob," Brenda said, her voice a low hiss, trying to maintain control of the scene. "People are grieving." "This won't take long," I replied, my gaze steady. I could feel the weight of the papers in my jacket pocket, a solid block of truth against my chest. In fact, I think it's the perfect time. It's a day for settling family matters, after all. The smirk vanished from her brother's face. A few more people in the room fell silent, their attention drawn to the quiet intensity of our standoff. I had the floor. "You were just talking about selling the house," I said, looking directly at Brenda. "You mentioned that my father's name was the only one on the deed, and that the will was straightforward." "This is highly inappropriate," Brenda whispered, her cheeks flushing with color. "I agree," I said. "What was inappropriate was the lie you've both been living for the last 26 years. I reached into my jacket pocket. The movement was slow, deliberate. Every eye in the room was on me. I pulled out the thick manila envelope my grandmother had left me. The paper was old and soft, the edges worn. "What is that?" Brenda asked, her voice sharp with suspicion. "This," I said, holding up the envelope, "is my mother's legacy." I opened the flap and pulled out the smaller, sealed envelope first, the one containing my mother's letter. "Before we get to the legalities," I said, my voice resonating in the now silent room, "I think you should all hear something, a voice that has been silenced in this house for far too long." My hands were surprisingly steady as I unfolded the letter. I didn't read all of it, just the most important part. My voice was clear and strong. "My dearest Jake," I began, reading my mother's words. "If you are reading this, it means I am gone. I am writing this because I need you to know how much I love you. This house, Jake, is more than just wood and nails. It was my parents' home, and it is my home. It is your legacy. I have made arrangements to ensure it will always be a safe harbor for you, no matter what storms may come. I need to know you will always be protected. Don't ever let anyone take it from you." As I read, I could feel the atmosphere in the room shift. The story they all thought they knew was beginning to crumble. I saw Mrs. Gable dabbing her eyes with a tissue. I saw confusion and dawning understanding on the faces of old family friends. I carefully folded the letter and put it back in the envelope. Then I took out the other document, the thick, legal-sized papers of the irrevocable trust agreement. I unfolded it and held it up. "And this," I said, my voice hard as steel, "is how she made sure of it." I looked directly at Brenda's brother, the real estate expert. "You seem to know a lot about deeds and wills. Perhaps you can appreciate this." I walked over to him and held the document out. "This is an irrevocable trust established by my mother, Helen Miller, before her death. It names me Jacob Thomas Miller as the sole beneficiary. It stipulates that my father, Robert Miller, was granted a life estate, the right to live here until his death. But he was never the owner. He was a tenant, a steward. The ownership of this property was legally and automatically transferred into this trust upon my mother's death. And upon my father's death, the trust is dissolved, and all rights, titles, and interests in the property at 123 Oak Street pass directly and without encumbrance to me." Brenda's brother took the document, his hands trembling slightly. He was a professional. He knew what he was looking at. His eyes scanned the first page, then the signature page, notarized and dated 26 years ago. The color drained from his face. He looked up, first at me, then at his sister, his expression one of pure shock. Brenda stared at him, her face a mask of disbelief. "What is it?" "It's a fake. It has to be a forgery," she stammered. He just shook his head slowly, handing the papers back to me as if they were poison. "It's real, Brenda," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "It's all legal. The trust, it supersedes any will. It supersedes the deed he had. The house, it's his." The silence in the room was absolute, deafening. Every person present had heard. Every person now understood. Brenda turned on me, her mask of composure shattering into 1,000 pieces. The polite, grieving widow was gone, replaced by a creature of pure, undiluted rage. Her face was twisted, ugly. You little snake!" she shrieked, her voice cracking. "You waited all these years to come here and do this? On the day of his funeral?" "The day of his funeral seemed appropriate," I replied, my voice dangerously calm. "It's the day the lie finally ended. The day the terms of the trust came into effect. The day the house officially became mine again." "This isn't your house," she screamed, the words echoing the ones she had thrown at me 2 decades ago. But this time, they were hollow, pathetic. "Oh, but it is," I said softly, holding up the document. "It has been, in truth, all along. You were just squatting here, living in my mother's house, the house she left to me." She looked around the room, at the stunned faces of her friends and neighbors, at the pale, defeated expression of her brother. She had been exposed. Her entire life, her status in this town, her carefully constructed image. It was all built on a lie that had just been publicly detonated. She saw no sympathy in their eyes, only shock and the dawning glint of judgment. The grieving widow was a fraud. The grand lady of the manor was a usurper. There was nowhere for her to hide. She just stood there, speechless, her mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water, her reign of deception over at last. The aftermath of the revelation was a quiet, awkward unraveling. Brenda stood frozen for a long moment, her face a maelstrom of fury and humiliation. The remaining guests, not knowing what to do or say, began to make their excuses. They offered me furtive, sympathetic glances as they filed out, murmuring quiet goodbyes that were meant more for the end of the drama than for the deceased. Within 15 minutes, the house was empty except for me, Brenda, and her brother, who was staring at the floor as if hoping it would swallow him whole. The silence that descended was heavier than any words. Brenda finally found her voice, but it was no longer a shriek. It was a low, venomous whisper. "You think you've won, don't you?" I didn't answer her directly. I turned to her brother. "As a real estate professional," I said, my tone all business, "you can advise your sister that I am being more than generous. She has 30 days to vacate the premises. She can take her personal belongings, the furniture she purchased, anything that is hers. But the house and everything in it that belonged to my mother or was here before she moved in stays." Her brother just nodded numbly, not meeting my eyes. Then I looked at Brenda, and I let the final, perfect piece of irony fall into place. My voice was quiet, devoid of malice, stating only a fact. "After all," I said, "this isn't your house." The echo of her own words, thrown back at her after 20 years, seemed to physically strike her. She flinched, a wave of dark realization washing over her face. She had been so thoroughly, so completely defeated by the truth. There was nothing left for her to say. She turned, her back ramrod straight even in defeat, and walked up the stairs without another word. A few moments later, her brother followed, scurrying away like the coward he was. I was finally alone in the house. My house. The smell of catered food still hung in the air, a phantom of the party of lies that had just ended. I walked from room to room, touching the walls, running my hand along the banister. It felt different now. The coldness was still there, Brenda's sterile touch still lingering like a bad perfume. But underneath it, I could feel the bones of the house, the history, my history. I went upstairs and stood in the doorway of what had been my bedroom. It was no longer a sterile guest room to me. I could see through the beige paint, see the scuff marks on the floor where my desk chair used to be, see the faint outline of the rock band posters I'd once taped to the walls. I crossed to the window and pulled back the heavy drapes, letting the late afternoon sun stream in. The honeysuckle vine was still there, thicker and more gnarled, but alive. I opened the window, and the sweet scent of my childhood filled the room. I didn't feel a rush of triumph. I didn't feel vengeful or smug. I just felt quiet. A profound sense of peace settled over me. The wound that had been open for 20 years, a deep, festering source of pain and anger, had finally been cleansed. The justice wasn't in taking the house from Brenda. It was in reclaiming the truth for my mother. Her memory had been honored. Her final wish had been fulfilled. I walked back downstairs and out the front door, pulling it shut behind me. I stood on the porch for a long time, the legal documents still in my hand. I thought about my father, about his weakness and his silence. I had come here to bury him, but in a way, I had also come here to understand him. His silence had cost me my home and my childhood, but it had also cost him his son. He had made his choice, and he had lived with it, and died with it. There was nothing left but a quiet sadness for the relationship we might have had. I pulled out my phone and called Sarah. She answered on the first ring. "Jake, how are you? How was it?" she asked, her voice full of concern. I looked back at the house, my house, standing solid and real in the afternoon light. "It was a lot," I said. And for the first time that day, a small smile touched my lips. "But it's over now. Everything's okay." I told her what had happened, my voice steady and calm. She listened in stunned silence, letting out a soft gasp when I told her about the reveal. "I'm on my way home," I said when I finished the story. "I'll be waiting," she said, her voice full of love and relief. "We're all so proud of you." I hung up the phone and took one last look at the house. I wasn't sure what I would do with it. Maybe I'd sell it. Maybe I'd fix it up and rent it out. Maybe I'd bring Liam and Chloe here one day and tell them the story of their grandmother, a woman they never met but who had reached across time to give their father back his past. The choices were mine to make. For the first time in my adult life, I was in control of my own story, free from the ghosts of that house. The silence was finally broken, replaced not by shouting or anger, but by the simple, undeniable power of the truth. And that was more than enough. The drive home was a long, slow exhale. The 2 hours on the highway felt like a decompression chamber, bringing me back from the crushing depths of the past to the familiar surface of my own life. The adrenaline from the confrontation had faded, leaving behind a profound and hollow exhaustion. I kept the window cracked, letting the rush of cool evening air wash over my face, trying to scrub the scent of lilies and old secrets from my senses. My mind replayed the scene in the living room on a loop. The shock on Brenda's brother's face, the ugly contortion of her features when her mask of grief finally shattered, the weight of my mother's letter in my hand. It was surreal, like a movie I had watched instead of a life I had lived. For 20 years, that house had been a symbol of my rejection, a place of pain I tried not to think about. Now, it was just a property, a complicated, emotionally charged property, but mine nonetheless. The power in that thought was quiet, but immense. It wasn't a feeling of victory, but of equilibrium, as if a great weight that had been tilting my world for half my life had finally been lifted, allowing everything to settle back into its rightful place. When I finally pulled into my own driveway, the sight of my house modest and unassuming, was the most beautiful thing I had ever seen. The porch light was on, casting a warm, yellow glow. Through the front window, I could see the soft flicker of the television, where Sarah was likely curled up on the couch. This was home. Not because of a deed or a trust, but because of the love that filled it. This was the safe harbor I had built for myself. Sarah must have heard my car, because the front door opened before I even had the key in the lock. She met me on the porch, her face etched with worry, and wrapped her arms around me without a word. I buried my face in her hair and just held on, breathing in her familiar scent. I was home. The battle was over. "Are you okay?" She whispered into my shoulder. "I am now," I said, my voice thick. Inside, the kids were asleep. The house was quiet. We sat at our small kitchen table, the same place we'd sat when I told her about the phone call, and I told her everything. I described the funeral, the empty eulogy, Mrs. Gable's kind words, and the final, explosive confrontation. I recounted every detail of Brenda's greed and her ultimate downfall. Sarah listened intently, her hand covering mine on the tabletop. When I finished, she let out a long breath. "Wow," she said softly. "Just, wow. She got exactly what she deserved. And your mom? Jake, what a gift she gave you. Not just the house, the truth." "I know," I said, feeling a fresh wave of love for the mother I barely remembered. "She protected me, even after she was gone." "So what happens now?" Sarah asked gently. 30 days. "Do you think she'll go quietly?" I laughed, a short, humorless sound. "Quietly? Brenda? Not a chance. This isn't over. The fight in the living room was just the public execution. Now comes the dirty work." I was right. The quiet peace of that first night was shattered 2 days later by a phone call. It was Brenda. Her tone was completely different from the shriek I'd last heard. This was a new tactic, one steeped in cloying, manipulative pity. "Jacob," she began, her voice sounding frail and shaky. "I'm calling to appeal to your better nature. I know things were said. We were all overwrought with grief. But I'm an old woman now. This house is all I have. Your father and I built a life here." I felt a flash of hot anger. Your father and I. The audacity. "The life you built was based on a lie, Brenda," I said, my voice cold and even. I was standing in my own kitchen, looking out at my son playing on the swing set in the backyard. The sight strengthened my resolve. "He loved me," she insisted, her voice starting to crack. "He wanted me to be secure. Can you really live with yourself, throwing a grieving widow out onto the street? What would your father think?" "I imagine my father is thinking about a lot of things right now," I said. "But his opinion, like yours, no longer matters when it comes to the ownership of this house. I've hired a lawyer, Brenda. He'll be sending you a formal notice. You have until the date we discussed to remove your personal property. If you have any further questions, you can direct them to him." There was a stunned silence on the other end. Then a click. She had hung up. She had tried to play the victim card, and it hadn't worked. I knew it wouldn't be her last attempt. The lawyer's letter went out the next day. It was crisp, professional, and ironclad. For about a week, there was silence. I tried to push it to the back of my mind, focusing on my work, on playing catch with Liam, on helping Chloe with a school project. But the issue of the house loomed. Sarah and I talked about it late at night. "What are we going to do with it?" she'd ask. "It's so far away, and so full of stuff." "I don't know," I'd admit. "Selling it feels like the easiest thing to do, just cut the last tie. But it also feels wrong, like I'm selling my mother's legacy." About 2 weeks into the 30-day period, I got a call from Mrs. Gable. Her voice was flustered. "Jacob, dear, I don't mean to be a nosy neighbor," she started, "but I thought you should know. There's a big truck in Brenda's driveway, an estate sale company. They've been carrying things out all morning. Furniture, boxes. It looks like they're clearing out the whole house." A cold dread washed over me. "What kind of things, Mrs. Gable?" "Well, the big furniture, of course, but also paintings, lamps. I saw them carrying out that lovely grandfather clock that used to be in the hall." "Wasn't that your mother's?" "It was. It had been my grandmother's. Brenda wasn't just taking her personal belongings. She was liquidating the entire contents of the house, my mother's possessions included, out of spite and greed." "I'm on my way," I said, my voice tight. I told Sarah what was happening, grabbed my keys, and got in my car. The 2-hour drive was fueled by a furious, protective energy. She would not do this. She would not erase the last physical traces of my mother from that house. When I pulled up, the scene was exactly as Mrs. Gable had described. A moving truck was parked in the driveway, its back ramp down. 2 men were carrying my mother's mahogany dining table down the front steps. I strode up the driveway, my heart pounding with rage. "Stop," I commanded, my voice sharp enough to make both men freeze. "Put that back in the house, right now." Brenda appeared in the doorway, her arms crossed. She had a smug, defiant look on her face. "You can't stop me," she said coolly. "These are the contents of the house I lived in. I'm selling them." "You are selling things that do not belong to you," I shot back. "That table, that clock, the paintings in the living room, they were my mother's. They are part of the property, and they belong to me." "Prove it," she sneered. "Do you have a receipt?" It was a low blow, and she knew it. Of course, I didn't have a receipt for heirlooms that were older than I was. The estate sale guys looked uncertainly between the two of us. "Everything that was in this house when my mother died stays," I said, walking right up to Brenda until I was standing on the porch. "You can take the cheap furniture you bought to replace hers. You can take your clothes and your knickknacks. But you will not take her memory. Do you understand me? If you try, I will call the police and have you charged with theft. Do you really want to add that to your public humiliation?" Her smug expression faltered. The threat of public legal trouble was something she understood. She stared at me for a long moment, her eyes full of hate. Finally, she turned to the movers. "Just take the things I've tagged," she snapped. "Leave the rest." She had lost again. She knew it. I spent the rest of the afternoon there, a silent guard watching as they loaded up Brenda's life. The sterile modern furniture, the boxes of clothes, the soulless decor. I stood by the door and checked every item they carried out. It was a miserable, draining process. By the time they were done and the truck had pulled away, the house felt cavernous and empty. Brenda gave me one last look of pure loathing, got into her car, and drove away without a backward glance. And then she was gone. I walked back into the silent house. It was a bizarre landscape of empty spaces and forgotten islands of furniture. The dining room was empty, except for the indentation in the carpet where the table had been. The living room held only my mother's old, worn armchair, which Brenda had obviously deemed too worthless to sell. Dust motes danced in the shafts of afternoon light. It was sad. Not just because of the memories, but because of the waste of a life, of a family. I wandered aimlessly, eventually finding myself in the basement. It was the one place that seemed untouched. It smelled the same as it always had, of damp concrete, sawdust, and oil. My father's workbench was still in the corner, covered in a thick layer of dust. This was his space, his sanctuary from Brenda's pristine, orderly world upstairs. On a whim, I started opening the drawers of the old metal cabinet next to the bench. They were filled with old tools, coffee cans full of screws and nails, and yellowed instruction manuals for appliances long gone. In the bottom drawer, tucked way in the back, I found a small, unassuming cardboard box. It was sealed with brittle, yellowed tape. My name, Jake, was written on the top in my father's blocky, uncertain handwriting. My heart skipped a beat. This was different from my grandmother's box. This was from him. With trembling hands, I pulled the box out and carried it over to the workbench. I used an old screwdriver to pry open the tape. Inside, it wasn't a legal document or some grand secret. It was just stuff, a collection of small, seemingly random things. My first baseball glove, its leather stiff and cracked. A bundle of my old report cards from elementary school, all held together with a rubber band. A photograph of my mother and me at the beach, both of us laughing, the corners soft and worn as if it had been handled many times. And at the very bottom, there was a small, spiral-bound notebook. It was the kind you could buy at any drugstore. I opened it. The first page was dated just a few months after I had been kicked out. My father's handwriting filled the page. October 12th, it read. Jake's 19th birthday today. I wonder where he is. I hope he's warm. Brenda said it's better this way, that we don't contact him. She said he needs to learn to be a man. It feels wrong. Helen would be so ashamed of me. I turned the page. And another. The notebook was full of entries, short and sporadic, jotted down over 20 years of silence. Saw a boy at the hardware store today. Tall, with dark hair, looked like Jake. For a second, I thought it was him. My heart just about stopped. Christmas. The house is so quiet. Brenda fills it with her family. They're nice people, I suppose. But they're not him. It's not the same. Found one of his old drawings behind the dresser in his room. A spaceship. I put it in the box. She would have thrown it out. Another year. Is he okay? Does he have a family? Does he hate me? I deserve it if he does. God, I deserve it. Brenda wants to remodel the kitchen. She says Helen's taste was so dated. I didn't say anything. I never say anything. I am such a coward. The final entry was from about a year ago. The handwriting was shakier. My heart has been acting up. The doctor says I need to take it easy. I think about Jake all the time now. What a mess I made of everything. I loved his mother so much. And I let this happen to her son. To my son. It is my greatest regret. I hope one day he'll know I was just weak, not evil. But I suppose there's not much difference in the end. I closed the notebook, my hands shaking. Tears were streaming down my face, dripping onto the dusty workbench. The anger I had held for my father for 20 years, the solid, righteous anger that had fueled me, simply dissolved. It didn't excuse what he did. His weakness had shattered my life. But the notebook wasn't an excuse. It was a confession. It was the story of a man trapped by his own cowardice, haunted by his choices, who lived a silent, lonely life of regret in a house that was never truly his home after my mother died. He hadn't been a monster. He had been a broken man who had made a terrible, life-altering mistake and was too weak to ever fix it. I sat there in the dusty silence of the basement for a long time, holding the notebook. I finally understood my father. Not with forgiveness, perhaps, but with a profound and aching pity. The house was no longer just a piece of property to be sold or a monument to my mother's memory. It was the site of a family tragedy. And now, it was my responsibility to write the final chapter. And for the first time, I knew exactly what that was going to be.